In this lesson, we're going to talk about creating overloaded methods. Now, we've seen overloaded methods quite a few times throughout this series, even from the very beginning. And I've always said, hey, let's ignore what IntelliSense says, that there's one of three. There's three versions of this method. We're just going to ignore the other two versions. We're going to use this version of the method. We'll talk about overloaded methods some other day. Well, today's the day. So what I want to do is start off by talking about the scenario where overloaded methods make sense to implement and to use, and then we'll actually demonstrate their use here in this variation on our hero and monster application that we've been working on. So you can see that I have open a CS-ASP_031. You can open it up and follow along with me. So take a look at the very bottom of this default.aspx.cs page. I have three methods that I've added that do very similar sorts of things. First of all, there's this display full stats of the monster method. Then there's this display monsters partial stats. And then finally, there's this display monsters name and health. And my original intent whenever building these was that depending on the part of the application that I'm in, I may want to display different information to the user about monster's current state. And so when I go to use these methods later on, and I choose display, and now I have several different methods all kind of strewn in here. Fortunately, they all start with the word display. Otherwise, I would have to like scroll through and find where in IntelliSense they are, have to remember their name. It just adds a little friction and confusion to the entire development process. So in this particular case, where we have three methods that almost do exactly the same sort of thing, they just vary a little bit by the number of input parameters or maybe what they return. This is a good candidate for creating overloaded methods. So what I'm going to do is back out of this, scroll all the way to the bottom, and I want to replace the names of these to be essentially the exact same method name for each of these lines of code. So I'm going to change this to display monster stats. And then I'm going to copy that name and paste it over this method name, the second one, and then the smallest one here, the last one. All right, so if we were to attempt to run this application, I don't have it wired up and using it just yet. Let's just go ahead and build it. The application will build successfully. Why? Because the .NET Framework sees these as three different methods. So how does it see it as three different methods? And how are these considered to be overloaded methods? Well, the first criteria is that each of the methods that share the same name have to have a different method signature. And a method signature is basically the number of input parameters and their data types. So you can see that in this first version of our display monster stats method that there are 4 input parameters and their data types are string, int, and double. That's different from the next version of the display monster stats method that has a string, int, and int. And then finally, it's different from the last version of display monster stats because we're only working with a string and an int. All right, so what you cannot do is this. Let me just paste in another competing display monster stats method. Now, notice that this has 2 input parameters, just like this one. It has a string and an int, just like this one. The only difference is that is the intent of the integer. The intent of the integer input parameter for this version is that it would represent the health. The intent for this version of the method signature, or this integer, is that it's used for damage maximum value. All right, so all looks good until we go to actually compile and run our application, at which point we'll get a compilation error, and it says that it already defines a member called display monster stats with the same parameter types. So therein lies the first violation. You cannot do that because they have 2 methods have the exact same method signature. All right. Now what you can do, which is kind of interesting, is you can have different return types between the overloaded versions of the methods. So say for example on this final version of the method, the smallest one here, I'm going to change this from being a void to returning a string, and I'm going to modify the body of this. And here, let me just paste it back here, and I'll just do a return string.format instead. Okay, let's see if that actually works now when we go up and try to use these overloaded versions of the methods in IntelliSense. So display monster stats, I open up a parentheses and notice that IntelliSense tells me that I have 3 different versions of this method. The first one, the smallest one, returns a string and it accepts the monster's name and the integer health. The second, I'm using the down arrow on my keyboard now to investigate the second version of this overloaded method. It returns void, however, it does accept string monster name, int health, and int damage maximum. All right, and then finally, the last one is also void. Now, just out of curiosity, let's go back down all the way to the bottom. Now that we've fundamentally changed the return type, can we go ahead and create this version of the display monster stats that returns void? So let me attempt to build this now. And unfortunately, no, you still cannot. Even though they return different values, void versus string, they still share the same method signature, and so that's still not allowed. All right. And so we can see that in the .NET framework, there are overloaded methods everywhere. In fact, from the very beginning when we were using string.format, so string.format, and I open it up, notice that there are 5 different overloaded versions of this method, okay? I could probably look through just about any of the other methods that we've used. I can't think of any off the top of my head. Oh, yeah, here the random.next. Random.next. It has 3 different versions. You can give it nothing, the max value, or the min and the max value, okay? They all do the same sorts of things. It's just you're constraining, you're adding and giving it additional information to constrain the output of random.next and so on. And I don't see any others that really pop off the page here to me. But therein lies the value of the overloaded method, all right? It gives the consumer, the developer who's writing the application and using these helper methods, some indication, some visual indication that these are all related somehow. They really just vary by the type of information that's being passed in, but I can rely on them to essentially do the same sort of job. Okay, so that's all I have to say about overloaded methods. We'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you.